My name is Cecilia Marin, and if you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I knew everything about my family. I was an archivist for over 3 decades, someone trained to preserve stories, not just read them. I thought the truth sat neatly in folders and albums pressed between pages like autumn leaves. But the truth, it has roots. It grows quietly in the dark. And sometimes it waits for you to be old enough, broken enough, brave enough to dig it up. It started with a box. The attic in my mother's house had always been off limits, partly due to the narrow steps, and mostly due to the weight of memory that clung to it. But after my mother's stroke, I had to clean things up. I was sorting boxes one by one, most filled with the usual: a high school diploma, a broken ceramic angel, even a dried corsage from a dance in the 50s. That's when I found the box. It wasn't labeled. It was buried under old curtains and a lopsided suitcase. It smelled of cedar and age. Inside were letters handwritten, folded with precision, tucked in matching envelopes. No stamps, no addresses. Just for Evelyn. That was my grandmother's name. She'd passed away almost 20 years ago. I had only known her as soft-spoken and somewhat distant. She always smelled like lavender and peppermints, and her hands had a way of folding into her lap like she was guarding something. I used to think it was elegance. Now I wonder if it was secrecy. Beneath the letters was something stranger, a photograph. It was old black and white and slightly warped, but not from our family albums. In it stood a man in a military uniform. Next to him, a woman who looked exactly like my grandmother except younger. Her face, radiant lips pressed into a secret smile I'd never seen in any of our photos. They were standing in front of a small chapel. The corner of the photo had been torn as if someone had tried to erase a piece of it. I stared at that image frozen. I'd cataloged thousands of photos in my lifetime. I knew what war-era portraits looked like. This one didn't fit. Not the dress, not the expression, not the man, and not the date. On the back in faded pencil, someone had scrawled, Eve and Jay, 1944. But here's the problem. My grandmother married my grandfather in 1946. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a cousin. Maybe she had a friend in the service. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But my hands didn't listen. They opened every letter in that box with trembling fingers. And with each one, my family unraveled like a badly sewn quilt. The handwriting was elegant. Old-world penmanship where the loops on the Y's were generous and the I's perfectly dotted. Some were signed J, some James. Every letter was addressed to my Eve. Not Evelyn. Not Mrs. Clark, her married name. Just Eve. The war takes pieces of me I cannot name, but your voice stitches me whole again. Promise me, Eve. Promise me you'll wait. I will build a life for us. Just you and me. No more hiding. My stomach nodded. Because the letters didn't stop in 1944. They went on through 45, even 46. The year she was supposed to be marrying my grandfather. The year the photos from her wedding were printed. And yet, here were love letters from someone else. Letters full of promises and pain and longing. Letters that made me feel like I was intruding on something sacred and forbidden. But it was the last one that changed everything. Folded smaller than the rest, like someone had tried to tuck it into the deepest corner, was a single page. Unlike the others, this one was in her handwriting. James, I received your letter and I can't stop shaking. I never thought you would come back. I never thought I'd have to choose again. Please forgive me. I had to protect her. I had to protect her. Her, not him. Her. I read that line 10 times. Had to protect her. Who was her? A child. I dropped the letter like it was hot. My breathing turned shallow. I sat on the attic floor, the box beside me. The memories of a grandmother I barely knew, collapsing like a house of cards in a breeze. Downstairs, the sound of a clock chimed 6 times. Evening? Shadows stretched across the attic floor. But I sat frozen, staring at that last line, as if the answer might surface if I stared hard enough. I had to protect her. The silence in that attic was deafening. That night I didn't sleep. I made tea I didn't drink. I opened the box again and again, hoping it would tell me more. Instead, I found something I had missed before. Tucked beneath the final letter was a scrap of a newspaper clipping. Yellowed, brittle. torn at the edges. The headline read, "Local nurse dies in tragic maternity fire." No date, no billing, no location. I didn't know what it meant, but something inside me cracked open. There was a story here, one my grandmother had tried so very hard to bury, and now I couldn't leave it alone. That night I dreamed in smoke. There was a fire in the distance, a shadowy woman running through a hallway, arms shielding something wrapped in cloth. And in the dream, I heard a name I didn't recognize, whispered like a prayer or a warning. Margot. I woke up with the taste of ashes in my mouth. Sleep deprived but electrified by what I'd discovered, I went back to the attic at dawn, flashlight in hand, as if the darkness held the answers. Daylight was too polite to reveal. The box was still there waiting, but I wasn't looking at the letters this time. I was after that clipping, that single scrap of brittle newsprint. There had to be more. It took hours of digital searching. I typed keywords: nurse maternity fire, 1940s hospital tragedy, until my fingers cramped. Finally, a breakthrough. The full article had been archived in a local university's microfilm library, about an hour's drive from where I lived. My car keys were in my hand before I even shut down the browser. At the archive, I felt at home in the smell of paper and silence. The librarian was kind, if curious. I gave her the date I'd triangulated from surrounding stories, October 1944, and within 20 minutes I was scrolling through grainy scans of newspapers. And there it was: maternity wing fire at St. Agnes Hospital kills one, injures infant. The article described a sudden electrical fire that broke out in the early hours of the morning. The building was old wooden, and it collapsed faster than anyone could have expected. One nurse died trying to shield a newborn. No names were mentioned. Just a line that made my pulse spike. Mother and child presumed missing possibly fled the scene. Investigation ongoing. Missing, possibly fled the scene. And then I remembered the letter. I had to protect her. The idea gripped me like a vice. Had my grandmother been that mother? Had she run from fire, from shame, from someone who threatened her child? And why hadn't she ever told anyone? I copied the article, printed a few blurry versions, and drove straight to my mother's house. I should have gone home. I should have waited. But waiting is for people who aren't standing on the edge of something that could rewrite their entire origin story. My mother was in her bed, still recovering, fragile and forgetful. But her eyes lit up when I sat beside her with the photograph. "Mom," I said carefully, "who is this man with Grandma?" She peered at the picture. "That's not your grandfather." "I know," I said gently. "Do you know who he is?" She squinted, and something flickered in her face. Not recognition, more like restraint. She handed the photo back and said, "That's a long time ago. Best not to go digging." I pressed on. "Did Grandma ever talk about a man named James?" The silence was instant, heavy, a pause that stretched into discomfort. "Why are you asking about this?" I told her, "Not everything, but enough. The letters, the photograph, the clipping." And then, out of nowhere, she whispered, "She was different after the war. Your grandfather saved her from something, but she never talked about it." Saved her from what? She didn't answer. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. She had a scar, low on her back. Looked like a burn. I saw it once when I was a child. I asked her, and she told me it came from boiling water. But she looked afraid when she said it, like the memory could crawl out of the dark and touch her. A burn, a hospital fire, a child, a man named James. It wasn't just a guess anymore. It was a thread, and I was pulling. Back at home, I spread everything across the kitchen table: photos, printed articles, the box of letters. It looked like a crime scene, except the only weapon was silence, and the victim was truth. I sat there for hours rereading everything. Then I noticed something new. One of the envelopes was addressed not just to Eve, but Eve W. Clark. That middle initial. I ran to my filing cabinet, pulled out birth records, family trees, anything I had in the archive of my life. My grandmother's maiden name was Winfield. That was it. Dewey for Winfield. But then another name surfaced, a whisper from a different drawer. Margot Winfield. It was a name from a draft of our family tree that my cousin had abandoned years ago. She'd written it in pencil, then erased it. When I'd asked, she said it must have been a mistake. There was never a Margot. But the eraser had left a ghost. Now it screamed. I called my cousin immediately. She picked up surprised, and I didn't even greet her. I just asked, "Did you ever hear of a woman named Margot Winfield?" There was a long silence. Then, "Where did you hear that name?" "I think she might be my aunt," I said, my voice trembling. "And I think Grandma hid her from all of us." Her breath caught. "She's not a myth," she whispered. "No," I replied. "She's a secret." The line went dead silent again. Not because she hung up, but because we both realized the same thing. Our family tree had a missing branch, and someone had sawed it off and buried it like it never existed. But the roots were still alive. I went back to the letters, heart pounding. And there, it was clear as confession. If they knew they'd take her from me, I couldn't let them label her. I couldn't let them shame her. I had to disappear. I had to let James go. For her, label her, shame her. My hands shook. Was Margot disabled? Was she born out of wedlock? Was there something about her that made society or our family want to erase her? And more importantly, where was she now? The next morning, I called the county archives. I requested every birth record for Margot Winfield in the 1940s and early 1950s. I pretended I was doing genealogical research, which wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. I wasn't tracing a branch of our family tree. I was digging for a ghost buried in its roots. By noon, a clerk called me back. "We found one," she said, hesitant. "But it's sealed." That usually only happens in special cases, adoptions, closed proceedings, or medical protections. I felt my stomach flip. "Is there any way I can see it?" "Only if you're a direct relative." "I am," I replied, voice firm. "She's my aunt." A pause. "Let me speak to a supervisor." While I waited, I stared at the box of letters on my desk. My grandmother's voice was alive on every page, terrified, defiant, tender. She had written like a woman trying to build a house of words for the child she could never claim. 20 minutes later, the supervisor came on the line. She was curt, professional. "We can't release the record, but I can confirm there is a sealed birth certificate under the name Margot Evelyn Winfield. Born April 2nd, 1945. April. The timeline fit. Does it say where?" "St. Agnes Hospital," she replied. "Of course. The hospital from the fire." So Margot had been born possibly during or just before the fire and disappeared into a sealed existence. I imagined my grandmother bruised and burned running from the collapsing hospital with a newborn in her arms. Alone, unmarried, afraid. But it wasn't just fear, was it? The way she wrote about Margot so fiercely, so protectively, it wasn't just secrecy. It was sanctuary. She hadn't just kept a secret. She had kept someone safe. From what I wasn't entirely sure. Shame. Institutions. Judgment. All of it. I called my cousin back. "What if I told you Grandma had a child before she married Grandpa?" I said softly. My cousin exhaled hard. "Then I'd say she was even stronger than we ever gave her credit for." There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then she added, "Do you remember that woman at Grandma's funeral? The one no one seemed to know?" I paused. I did remember. A woman in her 50s, quiet, sitting in the back. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't approach the casket, didn't cry. She had looked resolved. "I remember her," I said slowly. "She wore a locket," my cousin added. "And when I looked at it, I swear it had Grandma's photo inside." My pulse skipped. "Do you have any idea who she was?" "No name." "But she drove away alone." That night, I pulled out the funeral guest book. Most people had signed in clusters: the Harrow's sister Bernadette, the Clark family. But halfway down was a solitary name, Margot L. No last name, no contact info. Just Margot L. in cursive slanted left, like someone who wasn't used to signing in public. I stared at it for a long time. Could it be her? I looked back through the box and found another envelope I hadn't noticed before. It was thicker than the others, addressed in unfamiliar handwriting but clearly labeled. "To be opened if something happens to me." It wasn't from James. It was from my grandmother. And it was addressed to me. My breath caught. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the pages inside. There were 3. The first page read, "My dearest Cecilia, if you are reading this, then my fears came true. You were always the one with the eyes that saw behind things. I knew you would look deeper someday. I only hope you look with kindness. I never meant for you to carry this burden, but perhaps you are the only one who could. I had a daughter before I had a husband. Her name is Margot. I stopped reading, heart racing. She said it. She wrote it down. I continued. She was born out of love, but the world didn't see it that way. They would have taken her from me. They would have called her names, locked her away, and shamed her for things she could never control. She was different, you see. Not broken. Not wrong. Just different. She didn't speak like other children. She didn't look people in the eye. But she loved deeply in her way. She loved the sound of birds, the way sunlight moved through leaves. She would hum when she was happy, and I lived for those hums. But back then, difference was danger, and I was alone. James wanted to keep us both. He was willing, but I knew his family. They would have seen her as a stain. So I ran, I left him. I changed my name. I buried my past to protect her future. I was crying now quietly. My grandmother, who I had known as dignified and distant, had lived a life of silent war. The second page continued. Margot grew into herself. She is brilliant in ways the world still doesn't know how to measure. She paints. She gardens. She remembers everything. She chose not to marry. She told me once, I have everything I need in my flowers. We stayed in touch for a while in secret, but it became harder. My marriage, my children, the church, the whispers. So I gave her up again. Not to the state, to a woman I trusted, a caretaker who loved her like her own. They moved away. I've sent her letters every Christmas. I never got one back, but I kept sending. The final page. If you find her, tell her I never stopped loving her, that the silence was not absence, it was armor. And if you can forgive me, Cecilia, please forgive yourself for what you'll feel when you learn everything. With all the love I was never brave enough to show, Eve. I pressed the pages to my chest and sobbed. My grandmother had lived 2 lives, one for the world and one in hiding, one clean and proper and one honest and aching. And she trusted me to merge them. I wiped my tears and whispered aloud as if she could hear me. I will find her. It took 3 weeks and a dozen dead ends to find her. The name Margot L. was the only thread I had, and it unraveled slowly. I searched nursing homes, artist collectives, even mailing lists for people with special needs, advocacy connections. Nothing turned up. Then one night, desperate, I went back to that old guest book. I stared at the handwriting again. The slant, the curve of the G, the way she looped her T, I'd seen it before in one of the letters in the box. Not from Grandma, not from James. From a third person. One of the envelopes had no return address, but the writing matched. It was a short note. Thank you for the violets. The garden is full this spring. I hope you're well, M. There was no date, no context, but the envelope had a postmark. Ojai, California. Ojai, a quiet town with a long history of art colonies, spiritual retreats, and most importantly, privacy. I made the trip without telling anyone. I didn't want opinions. I didn't want warnings. I didn't want logic. I wanted Margot. The drive from L.A. was long and winding, the kind of drive that empties your mind of chatter. As the hills rose around me, I felt like I was entering a story someone else had closed years ago, pages pressed together by time and shame. I had no idea what I'd say if I found her. How do you tell someone, "Hi, I think I'm your niece, and I just learned that your mother never forgot you," even though the world tried to? When I arrived in Ojai, I went straight to the small public library. It was the kind of place where everything still smelled faintly of paper and cedar. The woman behind the desk looked like she'd worked there since the 1970s. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I'm looking for someone named Margot. Possibly Margot Winfield. Maybe Margot L. She's probably in her 70s. The librarian blinked. "Margot. Does she have a garden?" "I think so. And she might paint." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "You must mean Margot Lane. She's a fixture around here. Keeps to herself. Sweet lady. Bit. Different. Talks to birds. Once painted every flower in town on 100 rocks and left them in mailboxes. She's got a little house on Orchard Way." I could barely breathe. I asked for directions. She wrote them down carefully, adding, She doesn't always answer the door, but don't give up. Orchard Way was more of a lane than a street, lined with blooming lavender wild poppies and low stone fences. At the end stood a white stucco cottage tucked under a jacaranda tree bursting with purple blooms. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. I walked up to the gate, heart pounding. A painted wooden sign hung on the fence. Welcome to Margot's garden. Below it, a hand-painted butterfly. I rang the bell. Nothing. I waited. Counted to 30. Rang again. Still silence. Then I heard humming. From the back. High lilting. Wordless but melodic. The hum of someone entirely content in their own world. I followed the sound, careful not to step on the violets lining the path. In the backyard I saw her. A woman in a wide straw hat bending over a bed of roses. She wore a long linen dress stained with soil and humming softly to the plants, like they were old friends. Margot, I said gently. She stood up slowly and turned. Her face was sun-worn, gentle, and strikingly familiar. The shape of her jaw. Her eyes just like Grandma's, but softer, weeder. She looked at me with curiosity, not fear. She didn't speak. My name is Cecilia, I said. Cecilia Marin. My grandmother was Eve. Her eyes blinked once, twice. The name landed like a pebble in still water. Then she whispered, Eve. I nodded. She looked down, then back up. Her mouth formed the word again and again. Eve! Eve! I reached into my bag and pulled out the letter. She wrote this. For you. And for me? I handed it to her. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat down on a painted bench beneath a lemon tree. Her hands trembled as she held the envelope. She looked at me, tears forming. She's gone, isn't she? She asked. I nodded. Almost 20 years now. She looked away and pressed the envelope to her chest. Then, after a long silence, she said, I always knew she'd send someone. And then she opened the letter and read every word. When she finished, she was crying silently, the way people cry when their grief has aged into something quiet and brittle. I sat beside her, and for a long time neither of us spoke. Then she said, I used to draw her. From memory. When I was little, I kept them all. Want to see? She led me inside. The house smelled of lavender and oil paint. The walls were covered in art portraits, landscapes, abstract pieces, but all with one common thread. A woman's face. Over and over again. Eve's face. She had never forgotten. On a low shelf was a wooden box. Inside were dozens of postcards, unopened, pristine, tied in a ribbon. Each one postmarked in December. Each one from my grandmother. I never opened them, she said. I didn't want to be disappointed. I swallowed. She never gave up. Margot looked at me, tears drying on her cheeks, and whispered, Then I forgive her. The next morning, I sat with Margot in her kitchen, sunlight spilling through the window like honey. Everything in her home was soft and worn, as if it had been loved instead of merely owned. There were teacups that didn't match, and doilies that had clearly been made by hand. She made tea with orange peel and fresh rosemary, and served it in mismatched porcelain cups. She still hadn't opened the stack of postcards. I didn't ask why. Instead, I asked gently, Do you remember him? James? She looked down into her tea, then slowly nodded. I remember music, she said. He used to sing to me. He had a deep voice, like the ocean. I was stunned. I hadn't expected her to remember much at all. She'd been just a baby when Grandma left James. But memory is strange like that. Some things burn in, especially if they're tied to emotion. Do you remember leaving him? I asked carefully. Margot nodded again. There was yelling. Not at me. Around me. People saying I was cursed, that I'd bring shame. Mother ran with me. We hid in a church. I don't remember where. I was frozen. Her voice, usually light and airy, had taken on the rhythm of someone retelling a fairy tale they'd once believed was real. And the fire? I asked. She paused, looked out the window. Hot, bright. I couldn't breathe. She covered me. We were under a table. The hair on my arms stood up. This wasn't myth. This wasn't a story. It was real. She had lived it. I felt the letters pressing against my chest even though they weren't there. This woman, the missing name, the erased branch, had carried the weight of silence for decades. And still there was no bitterness in her, just quiet, as if she had made peace with her invisibility. But I couldn't. I wanted to know more. So I asked, "Why do you think she never told anyone? Not even my mother?" Margot shrugged. "She tried once. When I was 10, she took me to a town nearby, dressed me up. We were supposed to meet her husband, but then she changed her mind. Said I looked too much like her. Too much like the past." My throat tightened. Too much like the past. The past she'd never outrun, not really. "She loved you," I whispered. "She never stopped." Margot smiled. "I know. She didn't have to say it." Outside, birds chirped in her garden. The lemon tree rustled softly in the breeze. I looked around and saw the life she had built, simple, quiet, whole in its own rhythm. And then something strange happened. Margot stood up, walked to a corner of the kitchen and opened a drawer. Inside was a photo, old colorized. She handed it to me. It was of a man older wearing a hospital gown. He sat in a wheelchair smiling at someone off camera. On the back was written, "James W. Lane, 1988. The man who sang lullabies." My hands trembled. "You found him?" I asked. She nodded. "He had cancer. I visited him once. Told him I was okay." He cried. I stared at the photo, the lines of his face, the soft sorrow in his eyes. My grandmother had never mentioned this, had never once spoken his name aloud. And yet here he was, real, alive until the late 80s. "Did you ever tell Grandma?" I asked. Margot shook her head. I didn't want to break her again. The sentence stunned me. Break her again. As if Margot had carried not just her own silence, but her mother's guilt too. A secret kept in both directions. We sat for hours exchanging fragments of Eve, who she was to each of us, and who she had never allowed herself to be. Margot pulled out a small painting she'd done years ago. It was of a lighthouse on a cliff, waves crashing below. She handed it to me. "She said once she felt like a lighthouse," Margot whispered, "always standing still, always watching others leave and return, but never moving." I looked at the painting. It was haunting, stark, beautiful. "I think she was afraid," I said softly, "that the world wouldn't accept your light." Margot nodded, then looked at me with something I hadn't seen before. Certainty. "But I did," she said. "I accepted it. I was never afraid." She poured more tea, humming again. This time the melody was familiar. Something old. A lullaby, perhaps. The kind passed down through blood or dreams. "I want to show you something else," she said. She led me to a back room, dusty and dim. Inside was a small trunk. She opened it to reveal clothes from the 1940s, a tiny dress, a baby bonnet, and a blanket embroidered with the name Margot E. The stitching was clumsy but heartfelt. I could picture my grandmother's young hands doing it, nervous and full of hope. "She left these with me," Margot said. When she said goodbye, my chest ached. And just beneath the fabric was something else, a folder. Inside it, medical records, not from a hospital, from a state-run institution. Diagnosis: developmental delay. Recommend placement. Stamped. Refused by guardian. Signed, Evelyn Winfield. My grandmother had refused institutionalization. She had chosen her daughter. Over doctors, over church, over everything. The world had told her to abandon. She chose to protect. That was the legacy. And Margot, she was the proof that choice mattered more than shame. I hugged her before I left. She didn't cry. She simply said, "You'll come back right." "I will," I promised. Because you don't find a lost part of your family and leave it behind again. Not twice. Back home, everything felt quieter, but not in the comforting way. More like the silence after an explosion. The air still carried echoes. The walls still hummed with absence. I sat alone in my apartment. The box of letters now moved from attic relic to sacred object. My hands moved through them again, this time differently. I wasn't hunting anymore. I was witnessing, each letter no longer a clue but a confession, a benediction. The question now wasn't what happened. It was, what do I do with it? I knew I had to tell my mother. She was the only one left from that generation, and though her stroke had dulled parts of her memory, I believed something in her still waited for the truth. I visited her the next morning. She was sitting by the window knitting something that had no real shape, just a tangle of yarn that moved with her mood. She looked up as I entered and smiled faintly. You look tired, she said. I found her mom, I said quietly. Found who? Margot. She blinked. That name again? She's real, I said. She's alive. She lives in Ojai. She has a garden and a quiet life. She hums when she's happy. She remembers Grandma's lullabies. I showed her the photograph of Margot taken on my last day there. Her seated among blooming violets, a slight smile on her face, sunlight crowning her silver hair. My mother stared at it for a long time. Then something flickered in her recognition maybe, or guilt trying to stand up through the fog of years. She used to hum too, she whispered, when she thought no one was listening. I nodded. She's your sister, I said. She didn't reply. Instead, she put the photograph on her lap and sat very still. After a while, she said, I always felt like there was a room in our house we weren't allowed to open. I didn't know it had a person inside. I placed my hand over hers. She doesn't blame anyone. My mother's eyes shimmered. But I do. That night, I wrote Margot a letter. An actual letter on stationery. It felt right, an echo of Eve's own voice. Dearest Margot, I want you to know that the door is open. For visits. For stories. For holidays. For family. If you ever want to meet your sister, she's here. She's softer now. Slower too. But she's asking about you. We can build this carefully. Gently. There's no rush. But I wanted you to know. The silence is over. Love. Cecilia. I mailed it with shaking hands. 2 days later, I received a postcard. On the front, a watercolor of a lighthouse painted by hand. On the back, written in looping, confident letters, I'm ready to come home. M. We arranged the visit carefully. No surprises. A quiet Saturday afternoon. Margot came wearing a straw hat and brought a basket of lemons from her garden. My mother wore a pale blue cardigan, the one that used to be her mother's. When they saw each other, no words came, just tears. Margot walked forward, first arms open. My mother reached out and pulled her close, and they stood like that, swaying ever so slightly, two branches that had been bent away from each other for decades, finally touching again. I'm sorry, my mother whispered. You were only a girl, Margot replied. We sat in the kitchen for hours. Margot talked about her flowers, about James, about the caretaker who raised her after Eve's silence. My mother listened like someone trying to memorize a song she once heard in a dream. That night, I sat on my porch alone, watching stars blink into the velvet sky. I thought of my grandmother of Eve watching from wherever souls go when their stories are finally told. I imagined her smiling, finally light, finally unburdened. But one thing still burned inside me. The sealed birth certificate, the institutional diagnosis, the fact that Margot had been a hair's breadth away from being erased legally, physically, emotionally. And I couldn't let that be quiet. The next week, I published an essay anonymously at first about hidden children, about erased lives, about how families protect and betray in the same breath, about how society once labeled those with difference as disposable. I called it The Girl Who Was Never Lost. Just hidden. It went viral. People wrote to me, strangers, cousins, even historians saying they'd found similar letters, similar photographs, similar silences in their families, that they had grandmothers too who loved in secret, who made choices in dark corners of society's judgment. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a bridge between past and present, between silence and voice, between loss and restoration. One evening, Margot sent me a package. Inside, a small framed painting of 3 women. They stood in a garden under a blooming jacaranda tree, one in a straw hat, one with a cane, one sitting on a wooden bench with a box of letters in her lap. The title written in pencil on the back, The Family That Chose to Begin Again. Spring came quietly that year, as if it too had read the story and wanted to be gentle. Margot began visiting more often, always with something in her hands. A painted rock, a jar of lemon preserves, a new flower to plant in the garden. She didn't speak much when the whole family was gathered, but her presence was its own kind of language. A soft punctuation at the end of years of silence. We began to rewrite our rituals. Sunday lunches now included an extra chair hers. My mother, still recovering from her stroke, seemed to lighten in her presence. She'd touch Margot's hand sometimes in the middle of conversation, as if checking to see if she was real. And each time Margot would smile, that quiet, unassuming smile, the one that said, "I'm here. I'm real. I'm still yours." And the others? My cousins were skeptical at first. One even called me dramatic, said I was inventing legacy where there wasn't one. But over time, the weight of the letters and the clarity of Margot's gaze softened even the most resistant hearts. After all, how do you argue with someone whose existence you can feel in your bones? I took Margot to the cemetery one Sunday. The gravestone was simple. Evelyn Winfield Clark, 1922, Dortiemi Quatre. Beloved mother and keeper of songs. Margot knelt beside it, fingers brushing the etched name like a pianist testing a familiar chord. She pulled something from her pocket, one of the unopened Christmas postcards. Then with careful hands she tore it open. It read, "My darling girl, I send you light. Always light, even if it never reaches you. Know that my arms are full of memories of you. Love forever, Eve." Margot folded the card and placed it beside the stone. Then she said, "Now you can rest." And I believed her. That night we sat in my living room surrounded by photo albums. Some pages had blank spaces. Others had faces we no longer had names for. But we were filling them slowly, carefully. "Do you want to be added to the tree?" I asked her. "The family tree, I mean." She thought for a moment. Then, "Only if I get to add a root." I smiled. "Deal." So we did. On the family tree that hangs in our hallway, there's a new branch now. Margot Evelyn Winfield. Born 1945, still blooming. Beneath it is a small leaf-shaped tag. It doesn't list a profession or a title. Just one word. Survived. And she had. In a world that tried to erase her. In a family that forgot how to look for her. In the silence that lasted 60 years. She had survived. And now she thrived. One afternoon, Margot asked if I wanted to see her journals. She had dozens lined up on a shelf arranged not by year, but by color. "I don't write about what happened," she said. "I write what I see. It keeps the world soft." I opened one. Inside were sketches of birds, notes about cloud patterns, snippets of overheard conversations at the market. One entry read, "Saw a boy today chase a butterfly until it let him catch it. That's all we want, I think. To be trusted enough to land in someone's hands." I looked at her. "You're a poet." She shrugged. "I'm a gardener." Same thing, really. But not everything was easy. There were moments she grew quiet when the TV news showed stories of institutional abuse. Times when a loud noise would make her flinch. There was a day she froze in the supermarket, unable to speak, because the cashier's tone reminded her of someone long buried. She wasn't made of glass, but she had fractures that hummed when the wind blew just right. And still she smiled. Every day. "Why?" I asked her once. "After all that?" She looked at me, eyes unblinking, and said, "Because I was loved, even in hiding." I understood then. That love, even when silent, leaves its mark. That even when not spoken, it carves a space for someone to return to. And maybe that's what Eve had done. She had built a home in her letters. A home Margot finally entered. The last piece fell into place one afternoon, when Margot came over holding a small wrapped canvas. "I finished it," she said. I unwrapped it carefully. It was a portrait, 3 women in a kitchen. One seated, one standing behind her, and one holding a letter to the light. The colors were warm. The faces were soft. But what struck me most was the look in the eyes. All 3 were looking at each other. All 3. Seen. The painting's title scrawled on the back. Returned. I hung it in the hallway opposite the family tree, so anyone walking through our home would see where we came from and what we chose to become. The house felt different after that. Not just fuller though it was, but softer, as if the very walls had exhaled. As if the air no longer had to carry the weight of untold things. We began to speak more openly as a family. Not just about Margot, but about everything. Regrets. Missteps. The whispered griefs that had long burrowed into our lineage. One evening, after a quiet dinner, I found my mother in the living room staring at one of Eve's old photographs. It was a portrait of her as a young woman before the war, before the secrecy, before the silence. She always looked like she knew more than she said. My mother murmured. "She did," I replied, sitting beside her. But I think she also carried more than she could ever put into words. My mother nodded slowly. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if she had told us sooner. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about that question the way it holds both hope and grief in the same breath. Maybe we weren't ready. Then I finally said, maybe we had to grow into it. She looked at me and smiled, eyes brimming. Or maybe we had to wait for you. That night, I stood in front of the family tree and stared at the leaf that bore Margot's name. Beneath it, I wrote a small note in pencil, restored. Not just Margot, all of us. I started a project soon after, part memoir, part archive, part oral history. I interviewed Margot, my mother, my cousins. I dug deeper into our family's past than I ever had as an archivist. But this time, I wasn't filing someone else's story. I was collecting ours. I called the project The Letters We Never Mailed. And it wasn't just about Eve anymore. It was about every family that had buried its truth for the sake of appearances. Every grandmother who made impossible choices. Every child who was forgotten in name but remembered in heart. Every silence that was mistaken for peace. We held a gathering that summer, small, intimate. In Margot's garden. 3 generations came. Kids played in the flower beds. Elder relatives sat beneath shade trees sipping lemonade. Margot wore her straw hat and welcomed every person with the same words. It's good to be known. We planted a tree together at the far end of the garden, a jacaranda just like the one outside her cottage. It was small, fragile, but rooted. We buried a copy of Eve's letters beneath it, not to hide them, but to let them become part of the soil. Nourishment for something new. Margot said a few words as we finished. Simple ones. Things grow even in silence, but they bloom when they're spoken. Later that evening, as twilight stretched across the garden and cicadas began to hum, I found Margot sitting by herself sketching. "What are you drawing?" I asked. She turned the page toward me. It was a circle. Inside it, 3 faces. No names, just eyes watching, knowing, forgiving. I sat beside her and asked the question that had been living in me for weeks. "Do you regret any of it?" She didn't hesitate. "No, not even the lost time." She shook her head. "Time isn't the only thing that matters. Love waits. It might ache, but it waits." I exhaled. She was right. Love waits. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk with one of Eve's letters. This time I read it aloud. Her voice in my voice. Her story in my hands. I imagined her sitting across from me, watching, listening. And I whispered, "They found each other." The next day, I visited the attic again, not to search, but to return something. I placed the box of letters in a cedar chest lined with velvet. Not buried, not forgotten, preserved. Beside it, I placed a printed photo, Margot and my mother laughing beneath the jacaranda, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward the sun. And a note I wrote in block letters. "The secret is no longer hidden. She is no longer hidden. We are no longer hidden." Then I closed the chest gently, like tucking in a child. Outside, the jacaranda leaves shimmered in the wind, casting lavender shadows through the window. A breeze passed through the room, and I swear, if only for a moment, I smelled lavender and peppermints. Eve, she was here. And finally, she was at peace. By the fall, the entire family had begun to change. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in subtler shifts. Conversations were deeper, silences were softer. Even our arguments, still inevitable, held more patience. It was as if the act of revealing what had once been buried gave everyone permission to be more honest, more present, more whole. Margot became a fixture in our lives. She taught my niece how to press flowers between book pages. She showed my cousin's son how to identify birds by their songs. And one afternoon, she sat with my mother and painted her hands, each wrinkle, each vein, each scar, like they were lines from a sacred text. "She always hid her hands," Margot said softly as she worked. "I want to remember them as they are now. No hiding." I watched them from the kitchen, heart brimming. But not all moments were so gentle. That October, we received a letter from a distant uncle, someone who had never accepted the softness of our family. He had seen the essay I wrote. He called it emotional revisionism, accused us of romanticizing what he saw as shameful history. She should have given the child up like she was told, he wrote. It would have spared everyone the trouble. I held the letter in my hands for a long time before showing it to Margot. She read it, folded it, then said shame isn't mine to carry anymore, and she was right. I burned the letter in the fireplace that night, not out of rage but as a ritual, a cleansing. As the flames curled around the paper, I whispered to the fire, "We choose truth. We choose love. We choose her." It felt holy. That winter, Margot asked if we could visit the place where she was born. Saint Agnes had long since closed the old hospital, replaced by an office park, but a portion of the original foundation remained weathered bricks mossed over by time. We drove out together, just the two of us. She wore her straw hat and carried a single violet. When we arrived, she stood before the crumbling foundation and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she placed the flower between two bricks and stepped back. "This is where I came into the world," she said. "But it's not where my story began." That started the moment she chose to keep me. We sat on a nearby bench and ate sandwiches in silence. As we were leaving, Margot stopped and turned to me. She was brave, you know. Not perfect, but brave. I nodded. "So are you?" She smiled. "Maybe." But she was the first. And that truth, that simple, undeniable truth, sat with me like a warm stone in my pocket for weeks after. At Christmas, we decided to do something different. Instead of exchanging gifts, we each wrote a letter to someone in the family, past or present. Some wrote to Eve, others to their children. One cousin wrote to himself at age 16. Margot's letter was to James. She read it aloud, voice trembling. "Dear Papa, I remember your voice. I remember how it wrapped around me like a coat I couldn't outgrow. I want you to know I was okay, even when I wasn't, and I want to thank you for singing to me even when you thought I was asleep. I heard everything. Love." Margot. No one moved. No one breathed. Then my mother walked over to Margot and held her hand. And in that silence, healing cracked open a space for grace. After the holidays, Margot came to me with a new idea. "I want to donate the letters," she said. "To whom?" "To a museum. Or an archive. Somewhere people can read them. Learn from them." "You're sure?" I asked. She nodded. "They were never just for me. They were for anyone who's ever been forgotten." We chose a women's history center that specialized in family narratives, untold stories, and generational resilience. The director cried when she read them. She said they would become part of a permanent exhibit titled "The Ones We Almost Lost." And that, I realized, was the point all along. Eve's letters, Margot's painting, our family's truth. It wasn't about erasure. It was about reclamation. About standing in the middle of a story that once tried to erase you and saying, "I was here. I mattered. I still do." That spring, a journalist reached out. She had read the essay, heard whispers of the archive. She wanted to do a feature, something public, something national. I asked Margot. She smiled. "Tell them everything, but make sure they get her name right. Not just Evelyn Clark. Evelyn Winfield." That was her before the world told her who to be. So we did. The article ran under the title, "The Hidden Daughter and the Mother Who Chose Love." It included photos of Margot's paintings, quotes from the letters, and a shot of the family tree with her branch blooming full. But it was the last line that stopped me cold. A quote from Margot. "I was the family secret. Now I'm the family story." Months passed, and the story spread wider than we ever imagined. Messages flooded in from strangers, some who had lived similar truths, others who had buried them. There were letters from women who had been forced to surrender their children in the 1950s, from adults who had only just discovered their birth parents through DNA tests, from families who were still trying to find their own Margot. Each one shared something sacred, the ache of silence and the fragile hope of being found. I printed every message, cataloged them, and kept them in a new cedar box. Margot called it the box of second chances. She insisted we keep it in the living room, where guests could see it. "These stories deserve light," she said. "They don't belong in attics anymore." And she was right. That summer, we hosted a small gathering at the Women's History Center where Eve's letters now lived. The exhibit had been curated with incredible tenderness. Framed letters hung alongside watercolored pages from Margot's journals, photographs from our family archive, and a replica of the trunk that once held Eve's secret. Visitors moved slowly through the space. Some cried. Some stood in quiet contemplation. Others whispered to their companions things like, "I think my aunt had a baby no one talks about," or, "This reminds me of my grandmother." We had built more than an exhibit. We had built a mirror. Margot wore a soft lavender shawl that day and stood quietly at the entrance, greeting each person with a small smile and a painted bookmark. On the back of each one was the same phrase: "Truth doesn't shatter families. Silence does." One visitor approached her with trembling hands. An older woman, probably in her 70s, clutching one of the bookmarks. She said, "I gave up a daughter in 1962. I've never told anyone, not even my husband." Margot didn't speak. She just took the woman's hand and held it. That moment will stay with me forever. Back home, our lives continued, but with a different rhythm. Margot had become not just a restored member of the family, but something deeper. A symbol of what could happen when love wins over shame. When courage finally steps into the light. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch sketching again. "What now?" I asked, sitting beside her. She looked out toward the fading sky. "Now, we keep going. We write more letters. We tell more stories. We keep saying the names no one else will." I nodded. "What about the ones who still won't talk? The ones who stay angry? Or embarrassed?" Margot shrugged. "They don't have to speak. Just listen." It was then I realized. Her revenge wasn't loud or punishing. It was art, presence, continuance. It was the act of still being here, blooming anyway. That fall, she painted something new. A massive canvas nearly the length of a wall divided into 3 panels. On the left, a woman running through fire clutching something to her chest. In the center, a letter torn but glowing. On the right, 3 women, one young, one middle-aged, one old, planting a tree together. She called it inheritance. We hung it in the family room across from the fireplace. It changed the way we sat together, made us quieter, more reverent. That Thanksgiving, Margot said grace. It wasn't long or formal. She simply said, "For the ones who were hidden, for the ones who stayed, for the ones who left but never stopped loving, and for the ones still trying to come home. Amen." No one spoke for a long time after. The next morning, my niece came to me with a question. "Aunt Cecilia," she asked, "why did they keep Margot a secret?" I took a breath. "Because people used to be afraid of things they didn't understand. But we're not afraid of her," she said. "No," I smiled. "We're not? Then maybe we should never be afraid again," she said. And I wrote that down. I added it to the letters we never mailed now, officially being published as a small anthology by a university press. Proceeds were going to a fund for locating and reconnecting long-separated family members, especially those who had been lost due to outdated laws and shame-based decisions. We named the fund after Eve. The day the first copies arrived, I handed one to Margot. She held it like something breakable. Then, as she turned the pages, she whispered, "I thought I was the ending of something. But I see now I was the beginning." Winter returned, but it felt different this time. Less like an ending, and more like a pause, a breath between chapters. Margot had settled into our lives with such ease, it was hard to imagine the years without her. She now had her own chair at every gathering, her own mug in the kitchen, and a shelf of her artwork hanging in our hallway just above the coat rack. Visitors often stopped to admire them, paintings of women in gardens, of letters floating through open windows, of hands clasped in forgiveness. One weekend, Margot asked if we could visit the town where she'd grown up after Eve gave her away. She said she hadn't been back in decades. "I used to think it would be too painful," she said. "Now I think it might be healing." We drove upstate to a small town nestled between low hills and sleepy farmland. It felt like time had slowed there. The same old diner still sat on the corner. The same corner store, the same church steeple. As we walked the streets, Margot pointed out memories like they were landmarks. "That's where I learned to ride a bike. That fence I fell off and skinned my knees there. And that house. That one saved me." She gestured to a small brick house with ivy crawling up one side. "Mrs. Cole lived there. She raised me after Eve left. She wasn't warm, but she was steady. She never let me go to bed afraid. We stood in front of the house for a while. A new family lived there now. A child's drawing was taped to the front window and wind chimes tinkled softly from the porch. Margot smiled. It's nice to see it filled with life. Later that day, we stopped by the town's public library. Margot hadn't stepped inside it since she was a teenager. As soon as we walked through the door, the scent of old paper and ink hit us both like a wave. A librarian approached a man in his 40s with kind eyes. "Can I help you find something?" Margot hesitated. "I used to come here," she said quietly. "When I was small, I liked the poetry section." The librarian smiled. "Still there, still untouched." We followed him to a far corner. Dusty shelves lined the walls, and sunlight poured in through a high stained glass window. Margot ran her fingers across the spines of the books. She stopped at one, Emily Dickinson, selected poems and pulled it down. Inside, a name written in pencil, M. Winfield. She stared at it. "I used to write my name in the ones I loved," she whispered, "just to make them feel like mine." I felt a lump rise in my throat. The librarian returned a moment later, holding a small envelope. "I found this in our archives," he said, handing it to her. "It was tucked in a returned book years ago. No one ever claimed it." Margot opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of Eve, not the formal posed Eve from our family albums. This was different. She was sitting on a bench barefoot, holding a baby in her arms. "Margot." On the back, in Eve's handwriting, "My whole world before the world knew." Margot clutched the photo to her chest and whispered, "She left me pieces, even here." As we walked back to the car, she stopped and looked around the town once more. "It's strange," she said. "I used to think this place held only sadness, but now it feels like a chapter, not the whole book." We drove home in silence, watching snow begin to drift across the windshield like feathers. When we returned, the entire family was gathered at my house for a surprise. While we were gone, my niece had created a gallery wall in the living room. Photographs, letters, poems, Margot's paintings, all framed and arranged like a living mosaic of our rediscovered past. At the center hung the family tree, but now it had been redrawn. Not just names and dates, but colors, brush strokes, symbols for choices, for losses, for recoveries. Margot's branch now stretched wide with smaller leaves branching from it labeled Grace, Forgiveness, and Legacy. She stood in front of it, stunned. My mother walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. This time, she said softly, "You're not just in the picture. You're in the frame." And we all stood there, 3 generations, eyes glistening, as Margot slowly, gently reached out and touched her name. The following spring, something remarkable happened. Margot was invited to speak at the Women's History Center, where Eve's letters were archived. They were holding a panel on the silent stories of women, and they wanted Margot not just as a subject of the story, but as a storyteller. She hesitated at first. "I don't like microphones," she said. "You don't have to be perfect," I told her. "Just real." She looked down at her hands, hands that had painted, planted, and penned memories onto every surface of her life. "Real, I can do." The event took place in a sunlit hall, lined with framed portraits of pioneering women, activists, educators, mothers, daughters. As Margot walked in, several women stood, not out of ceremony but out of reverence. Somehow, her presence demanded it. She stepped up to the podium with her straw hat in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. The room quieted. She began, "For many years, I believed I was born wrong. That I was a secret meant to be kept quiet. I didn't speak much. Not because I didn't have thoughts, but because I didn't believe they would matter. And then one day, someone opened a box in an attic. Inside that box was proof that I had been loved. Loved fiercely, loved in silence. Loved enough to be protected even at the cost of belonging. I am not angry. I am not bitter. I am here. And in being here, I hope I can be a mirror for someone else who thought they were lost. You are not lost. You are waiting to be found. And your truth, however messy or quiet or late, is still worthy of daylight." Silence. Then applause, quiet at first, then growing into something standing and tearful and electric. Afterward, a woman approached Margot. She was shaking as she clutched a small envelope to her chest. "I haven't opened this in 20 years," she said. "It's from my daughter. I wasn't ready before. But I think I am now." Margot took her hands and simply nodded. "You don't have to open it yet," she said. "Just don't bury it." That phrase became something of a mantra in the weeks that followed. Don't bury it. I found myself saying it to friends, to colleagues, to myself. It applied to more than just letters. It applied to feelings, to dreams, to identities, to truth. Margot's story rippled outward. She was invited to appear on a podcast, a public radio segment, a feature article in a national magazine. She declined most of them not out of fear, but out of clarity. "I don't need a stage," she said. "I just need to be heard by the people who never knew I existed." But she did agree to help with a documentary about lost family lines and rediscovered kinships. She met with other people like her, men and women who had been forgotten by history, but rescued by persistence DNA kits, and sometimes pure luck. One woman had spent 40 years searching for her mother and found her 3 weeks after she died. Another man discovered he had 5 siblings, all raised by different families. Each story added another layer to Margot's, and yet none of it made her retreat. She remained rooted, steady, present, and her art changed. She painted less for herself and more for others. Portraits of foundlings, family trees shaped like rivers, lighthouses not alone on cliffs but nestled among homes. Her style softened, less abstract, more personal. And one day she brought me a new painting, a simple image, a box, open, inside a tangle of letters, and from it light pouring out like golden thread. She handed it to me and said, "It's time." "For what?" I asked. "For you to write the next one." I didn't understand what she meant until that night when I sat with my journal and realized I hadn't written a single thing about myself in months. I had been so consumed by telling Eve's story and Margot's story and everyone else's story, I'd forgotten mine. So I began. I wrote about being the bridge between generations. I wrote about the guilt I felt for not knowing sooner. I wrote about how sometimes love doesn't come as a lightning bolt. It arrives like a warm coat left on your shoulders when you're not looking. And I wrote about how Eve's secret gave birth to my purpose. That summer, Margot and I were invited to a writer's retreat in the mountains. A week of quiet nature and unspoken words waiting to be found. On the second night, we built a fire under the stars and read aloud from our letters, some never sent, some never finished. And when it was Margot's turn, she read something new. To the girl I used to be. "I forgive you for being afraid. I forgive you for believing what they said. I forgive you for thinking love had to hide. And I promise your story will not be buried again." By autumn, the story had ripened into something living, breathing, no longer just a series of events, but a shared legacy. The women in our family began meeting every month. We called it the Violet Circle after the flowers Margot always carried. No agenda, no structure, just a safe space for truth. Sometimes we shared stories. Other times we simply sat in the quiet together. That too was sacred. Margot became our quiet matriarch. Not in title, but in spirit. She didn't command a room, she anchored it. One evening she brought out a new project. "I've started a book," she said. "A memoir." I asked, surprised. She smiled. "A field guide." To what? To surviving silence. The pages were hand-stitched, the cover painted in watercolor. Inside were sketches, quotes, questions, and small essays, each one more like a breath than a chapter. Some of the entries read, "Don't confuse being invisible with being unworthy. Some flowers only bloom after fire. Your voice is not too late. It is right on time." She handed me a copy. "For the ones who come after us," she said, "the ones still afraid to speak." I read the whole thing that night under a dim reading lamp, tears falling freely. That week, we decided to do something we'd never done before. Hold a family photo session with Margot in the center. We hired a photographer and set the scene in her garden. She wore a linen dress the color of fresh cream and held a bundle of lavender in her hands. My mother sat beside her in a pale blue shawl. I stood behind them with the younger generation around us, forming a loose circle, protective, present, proud. When the shutter clicked, I felt something in me lock into place. This wasn't a recreation of a family that had always been whole. This was a testament to one that chose to become whole again. Afterward, we shared a meal beneath the string lights. Margot recited poetry. My niece played guitar. My cousin read a letter she'd never mailed to her estranged father. And then my mother, soft-spoken, often tired, stood and raised a glass. To Eve she said, who did what she could with what she had. And to Margot, who taught us that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering better. We clinked glasses. That night, Margot stayed over at my house for the first time. We made tea and sat by the window watching the moon rise. She turned to me and asked something that caught me off guard. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if she hadn't kept the letters? All the time, I said. Do you think you would have found me? I think I would have felt the space where you were supposed to be, I said. And I wouldn't have stopped looking. She nodded slowly. That's all I ever wanted. To be looked for. The room fell quiet. Outside wind stirred the trees. And then gently she said, I think I'm ready. For what? To write her back. She pulled out a blank sheet of paper, smoothed it on her lap, and began. Dear Mama, I waited a long time, but I never stopped believing you loved me. I see now you left so I could stay whole. You hid me so I could grow without fear. You wrote me into the world even when you couldn't speak my name aloud. And now I write you back. Thank you for choosing me. I'm choosing you too. She folded it, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it between two books on the shelf. I don't need to send it, she said. I just needed to say it. In the weeks that followed, something loosened in Margot. She laughed more easily. She painted in brighter colors. She even danced once barefoot in the living room, twirling like a child as music from the radio floated through the air. She's lighter, my mother said one afternoon. She's free, I replied. And she was. One crisp October morning, I woke to a small box on my porch. No note, just my name written in Margot's hand. Inside, a painted stone, smooth and oval. On one side, a violet. On the other, she was never lost. She was just waiting. I held it close, pressed it to my heart, and wept. Not from sorrow, but from awe. Of all the things Eve could have left behind, wealth, land, possessions, this was the inheritance that mattered most. A secret once buried, now blooming. That winter, Margot started a new tradition, the letters night. Once a month, anyone in the family or from the community could come to her cottage and write a letter. To a parent, a sibling, a version of themselves, someone gone, someone yet to be met. There was no pressure to share, just to write. She set out stacks of thick paper envelopes, pens, and teacups. Her tiny house glowed with warmth. Lamplight, cinnamon, the hum of Ella Fitzgerald on the old radio. The first night, 6 people came. The next 12. By the third, there were 24. A woman drove in from 2 towns over just to write to her mother, who had died in 1979. I never said goodbye, she whispered, folding the letter with trembling hands. Margot told me afterward, we bury too much in silence. These letters are little funerals for the words we swallowed. I nodded. But they're also resurrections. She smiled. Yes, exactly. That spring, the Women's History Center asked to make the letters we never mailed part of their traveling exhibit. They wanted to take Eve's story and Margot's to schools, libraries, and community centers around the country. Margot agreed under one condition. They have to include a writing table, she said, so visitors can write their own. The exhibit launched in March. On the first day, a high school student wrote, to the father I never knew, I forgive you for being missing, but I won't let the hole stay empty anymore. I'm going to plant something in it. Margot kept a copy of that note on her fridge. It was around this time that her health began to waver. Subtle things, tiredness, forgetfulness, shortness of breath on the stairs. She brushed it off at first. Just age, she said. But one afternoon while watering her garden, she sat down suddenly and whispered, the world is spinning too fast today. We took her to the doctor. Tests, scans, blood work, a quiet room. A doctor who didn't know how to say things softly. Congestive heart failure. Manageable, he said, but not reversible. Margot was calm. She listened, nodded, asked a few questions. And then, on the way home, she said something that made my hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter. I'm not scared. I've had more years than I thought I would. I just want to use what's left to keep planting. And she did. She taught my niece how to grow lavender from seed. She painted a final portrait, Eve's hands clasped in her lap, with a letter resting gently between them. She wrote letters to every member of the family. They were tucked into sealed envelopes marked, "Open when you need it most." She even wrote one for herself. To the girl who was told to hide it read, "You did more than survive. You turned silence into shelter for others." One day she asked to visit the attic again, the one where it all began. We climbed the narrow steps together slowly. I brought a chair and placed it near the old cedar chest. She sat looking around. "Funny," she said. "For so long this place was a tomb, and now it feels like a nursery." I opened the chest. The letters were still there, the originals, fragile, sacred. Margot reached out and touched them gently like the shoulder of a sleeping child. "I think it's time to let them rest," she said. Together we wrapped the letters in linen and placed them in a memory box, not to lock them away but to cradle them with reverence. Margot added one last thing to the chest, the violet-painted stone she had given me. "They belong together," she said. That night we sat in the garden. The jacaranda tree was blooming, early lavender petals drifting down like blessings. Margot turned to me and asked, "Do you think people change?" I paused. "I think people remember who they are," she smiled. "And do you think stories ever end?" I looked at her. This woman who had been hidden for decades, erased from the narrative, now the heart of everything we knew. "No," I said. "They just keep unfolding through the ones who carry them." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll sleep easy." And she did. Under the moonlight, surrounded by her violets, a blanket around her shoulders, Margot leaned back in her chair and drifted into a nap. She woke up the next morning with a smile. It happened quietly, just like her. One morning, I came to bring her lemon scones, the kind she liked with honey butter, and found the garden undisturbed, the teacup from the night before still half full, a book left open on the arm of her chair. A collection of Dickinson poems, of course. Margot had passed sometime in the early hours, peaceful, at home, in her sleep. The doctor said it was her heart, but I knew better. Her heart hadn't failed her. It had simply done all it came to do. The funeral was held beneath the jacaranda tree, the same one she had planted with us on that warm spring day. The blossoms were falling like purple rain. The same bench where she painted, the same garden that once bloomed with second chances. We didn't wear black, we wore lavender. And instead of eulogies, we read letters. Some were from her sealed envelopes she had left behind, each one titled in her handwriting. "To my sister for when the house feels too quiet." To my niece for the first time someone calls her strange. To Cecilia for when the world begins to forget again. Mine read, "Dear Cecilia, you were the voice that cracked the attic open, the hands that carried my mother's silence into sunlight. You didn't just find me, you made room for me. And when I go, please don't mourn the silence. Celebrate the fact that it was broken. Keep writing. Keep remembering. Keep listening for those who've never been heard. And always plant violets. Love, Margot." I didn't cry. Not then. I just folded the letter and placed it in my coat close to my heart. Later that evening, I walked the garden alone. The guests had gone. The candles had burned down. The wind was soft, and I saw it near the roots of the jacaranda. A small envelope tucked in the crook of the earth, weather-worn, faded. I bent down and opened it. Inside, a letter from Eve. "To Margot, if you're reading this, it means you stayed. You lived a full life. You found your way back to the place where I could not go. I am proud of you. I always was. I just didn't know how to be loud about it. Thank you for becoming the woman I prayed for in silence. Thank you for turning the locked door into an open garden. You were never the secret. You were the seed." I stood there for a long time, letter in hand, listening to the sounds of a garden no longer hushed. Birdsong, wind, the rustle of violet leaves. After her passing, we created the Margot Project, an organization that helped reconnect fractured families, archive untold histories, and support individuals navigating the aftermath of generational silence. Her artwork became our emblem, her words our compass. And each year on the day she passed, we gather beneath the jacaranda. We write letters. We plant violets. We say her name out loud. Not because we need to remember her, but because she taught us how to remember each other. Sometimes I still feel her in the breeze brushing past like a page turning gently on its own. Sometimes I dream of her walking through the garden humming that soft lullaby with no words. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear Eve whispering too, her voice no longer hidden, no longer trembling. Just proud. Margot was never erased. She was waiting to be written. And now, she's everywhere. The truth has finally found its voice. We like to think of history as something told in headlines and history books, but the real stories live in attics, in boxes, in the silences between generations. The family secret. My grandmother tried to bury isn't just about Eve or Margot or even me. It's about what happens when we choose to turn toward the forgotten, the misunderstood, the hidden, and invite them back into the light. This story taught me that secrets don't always come from malice. Sometimes they're born of protection, sometimes shame, and sometimes love that didn't know where to go. But the passage of time doesn't make them disappear. It just makes the silence heavier. Margot showed me that even those who were pushed to the margins can find their way back into the center. She didn't demand revenge. She didn't ask for pity. She simply wanted truth. And in telling it, she made room for others to do the same. So I'll end with a call to action. Not dramatic, not grand. Just an invitation. Look in the attic. Open the box. Ask the question you were always too afraid to ask. And when the answer arrives, be gentle. And then tell the story. We need it more than we know.